Imagine being 19 years old with $43 to your name, no family, no home, and no plan beyond making it to tomorrow. That is exactly where Caleb and Nora were standing on a Thursday afternoon in early October when their car died on the shoulder of a two-lane highway, and not in the dramatic, sputtering way cars die in movies. One moment the engine was running. The next moment, complete silence. Just the ticking of a cooling engine and the sound of the wind coming off the coast. Caleb tried the key a second time. Nothing. Not even a click. He popped the hood, the way he always did when something broke, and stared at the engine with the kind of focused calm that only comes from spending years solving problems that nobody else was going to solve for you. He had taught himself basic mechanics from library books and free videos on public computers. But standing there on the side of the road with no tools and no money for parts, he already knew what this moment meant. The car was done. And with it, the last roof they had. Nora was already pulling their things from the back seat before he even said a word. 2 backpacks. A sleeping bag. A plastic bag of clothes. Everything they owned fit in their arms, and they had gotten used to that fact a long time ago. She pointed down the highway where a green sign read Cedar Point, 3 miles. And so they walked. This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about magic or coincidence. It is a story about what happens when the right people end up in the right place at the right moment, and what they choose to do when they get there. Caleb and Nora had aged out of the foster care system 14 months earlier, on the same day, in the same group home where they had grown up side by side from the time they were 15. The system had handed them each a folder of paperwork, wished them good luck, literally, 2 words, good luck, and closed the door. No money, no support network, no housing plan. Just the world and whatever they could figure out on their own. What they had figured out was each other. For 4 years, through shelters and motels and eventually a second-hand car they bought for $300 from a man in a parking lot, they had taken care of each other with a precision and loyalty that most adults spend decades trying to build. Caleb fixed things. Nora organized things. He read manuals. She kept lists. Between the two of them, they had developed a survival system that was almost elegant in how efficient it was. But efficiency only takes you so far when you have $43 and a dead engine. Cedar Point appeared around a bend in the highway, a small harbor town sitting on a natural inlet, the kind of place that looks like it used to be something. Main Street ran parallel to the waterfront, flanked by storefronts where more than half the windows were covered in brown paper. The docks were quiet. The fishing boats tied up along the piers looked like they had not moved in months. The whole town had the feeling of a place that had forgotten what it was supposed to be. The only thing with any life in it was a corner diner called the Compass Rose, where a woman named Bee was wiping down tables in the late afternoon light. Caleb and Nora went in, mostly because they had nowhere else to go. They slid into a booth and opened the menu the way broke people open menus, scanning prices before descriptions, doing the math in their heads before deciding anything. Bee was in her 60s, silver-haired, unhurried, and sharp in the way that only comes from spending 30 years watching people walk through a door. She took one look at the 2 teenagers with their backpacks propped beside them and their eyes on the cheapest section of the menu, and she did not say a single word about it. Instead, she came over and said she had made too much chowder that morning, that it would just go to waste, and would they mind doing her a favor by helping her finish it. They both knew what she was doing. She was feeding them for free and wrapping it in kindness so they could keep their dignity. Nora said they would not want it to go to waste. And so they ate, thick, hot chowder with bread on the side and coffee that came without being asked for, and it was the first real meal either of them had eaten in days. Before they left, Bee mentioned that there was a surplus auction down at the harbor that afternoon. The town was selling off old dock equipment, broken crab pots, things nobody wanted. And this year, she added, they were also selling boats. Ones that had been sitting too long. Caleb said they did not really need a boat. Bee paused at the edge of their table and said, simply, that a boat has a roof. Then she walked back to the kitchen. The auction was held on the main pier. A folding table, a portable microphone, and maybe a dozen locals arranged in lawn chairs with the energy of people who had shown up out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. The auctioneer worked through the lots quickly. Old dock line, rusted anchor chain, a boat trailer with 2 flat tires. Nothing generated excitement. Everything felt like a town clearing out a garage it had been avoiding for years. Then the auctioneer got to lot 17. He read from his clipboard in the flat tone of a man reciting a legal document. Final item, the Clara May. A 42-foot steel-hulled fishing trawler. Last registered owner, one Captain Gideon Hale, status missing, presumed dead. The vessel had been moored at Slip 14 for 8 years. The town had been covering the docking fees. Sold as is, no warranty. He looked up and opened the bidding at $100. Nobody moved. He dropped it to 50. Then to 25. Then to 10. He made a small appeal to the crowd's common sense. Scrap metal alone was worth more than $10. Still nothing. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the front muttered something. A man at the back of the crowd, standing with his arms crossed in a windbreaker that said Harbor Master on the chest, stared at the boat with an expression that was hard to read. Caleb looked at Nora. She was already staring at Slip 14. The Clara May sat low in the water, listing slightly to one side. The hull was streaked with rust and barnacles. The wheelhouse windows were fogged with years of salt buildup. Gold droppings covered the deck. She looked, in every visible way, like something that should be left alone. But Caleb had read enough about boats to notice what mattered. The hull was steel. Not fiberglass. Not wood. Steel. Steel hulls do not rot and they do not crack. They rust, but rust can be treated. A steel hull, properly maintained or properly restored, is one of the most durable structures you can put on the water. And beneath all that grime, the bones of this boat still looked solid. When the auctioneer called going once at $10, Caleb raised his hand. The crowd turned. The harbor master went still. The auctioneer blinked, then said sold, and it was done. For $10, 2 homeless teenagers owned a boat the whole town called cursed. The paperwork took 10 minutes. Caleb counted out the money in ones and coins. The auctioneer handed him a manila envelope with the title, the registration, and a set of keys on a corroded brass ring. He said good luck with her in the tone of a man who did not mean it optimistically. They walked down to Slip 14 and stepped aboard. The Clara May was bigger up close. 42 feet of scarred steel stretching out in front of them, with a working deck at the stern, a midship wheelhouse, and a forward bow that had seen decades of open water. The deck groaned under their weight but held. The gull nests in the rigging would need clearing. The rust and grime would take days of work. But when Caleb knelt down and knocked his knuckles on the hull plating, the steel rang back firm and true. No soft spots. No thin patches. This boat had been neglected, but it had not been broken. They found the cabin below. Small, low-ceilinged, smelling of old diesel and salt and years of closed air, but dry. A small galley with a 2-burner stove and a sink. A fold-down table. Storage benches. And at the bow, a narrow forward berth with a mattress that had seen better days but was solid and dry. They spent the rest of that afternoon cleaning. Washing down the deck with the hose from the dock, scrubbing the galley, opening every hatch and window to let fresh air move through the hull. By evening, the Clara May was not beautiful. But she was livable. Caleb got the propane stove working. Nora found canned goods sealed in a cabinet under the bench seat. They heated soup at the fold-down table and ate while the last of the daylight came through the wheelhouse windows. That night, for the first time in months, Caleb did not wake up every 2 hours to check that nobody was trying to break into the car. There was no car. There was a steel hull between them and the world. And steel, he had already decided, does not break easily. They spent the next 2 days working. Caleb went into the engine compartment with the methodical patience he had always applied to mechanical problems. The diesel was a mess, corroded fittings, seized valves, fuel lines that needed replacing. But nothing was cracked. Nothing was fundamentally broken. It just needed someone willing to take it apart and put it back together. He had done that with the group home van when he was 16 because no adult had bothered to fix it and kids needed to get to school. A marine diesel was larger and more complicated, but the principles were the same. Nora cleaned the rest of the boat with the systematic precision that was her version of the same instinct. She worked through every compartment with a list in her journal: what needed fixing, what needed buying, what needed learning. She found the manual for the boat's water system tucked behind a panel in the head and read it cover to cover before she touched a single fitting. B came by at noon both days with leftover food from the diner. She called it waste prevention. They called it breakfast. On the second evening, they decided to explore the lower hold more carefully. It was a narrow space beneath the main deck, accessed by a hatch near the stern. Caleb had glanced down on the first day and seen nothing but dark and about 2 inches of bilge water. Now they went down with a flashlight and looked properly. The lower hold was low-ceilinged and tight. The bilge water was shallow and the hull plating looked sound, no weeping seams, no active leaks. The space was mostly empty. A few rusted tools on hooks, an old bucket, a coil of wire. Nora moved along the port side with the flashlight, running the beam across the steel and checking for damage. She stopped about 2/3 of the way forward. She knocked on a section of hull plating with her knuckles. The same dense ring as everywhere else. Then she moved her hand 6 inches to the right and knocked again. Different. Not hollow, something more subtle than that. A deadened, absorbed sound, like there was something behind the steel dampening the vibration. Caleb got closer and ran his fingers along the edges. Every other seam on the hull was original shipyard work, rough, uneven, decades old. This seam was smoother, neater. And along the bottom edge, where the plate met the frame, there was a thin, precise bead of marine epoxy. The kind used to seal a repair against moisture, permanently. Someone had sealed this plate shut. Recently, compared to the rest of the boat. On purpose. There was something behind that wall. They went to the harbor workshop at first light. The padlock on the door had not locked in years. Inside, the walls were hung with tools that had not been touched in a long time. Caleb found a flat pry bar, a cold chisel, and a rubber mallet. Nora grabbed a fresh flashlight from the shelf. Back in the lower hold, Caleb worked the chisel under the edge of the sealed plate. The marine epoxy was tough and had been applied carefully, thin, precise lines, the work of someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to last. It took 20 minutes just to free the first 6 inches. But he worked steadily down the left side, across the bottom, and up the right. Nora helped him pry the last section free. The plate shifted. He got the pry bar behind it and pulled. Behind the steel was a cavity in the hull, about 3 feet wide, 2 feet tall, 18 inches deep. Built between the inner hull plating and an outer frame. A space that would not appear on any standard inspection because it looked exactly like part of the boat structure. Inside the cavity was a waterproof marine chest. Dark green. Heavy duty. The kind commercial fishermen used to store documents and electronics in harsh conditions. It had 2 brass latches and a 3-digit combination padlock. Caleb pulled it out carefully. It weighed about 20 pounds. He set it on the floor of the hold and they both knelt beside it. The lock had 3 dials. He tried the obvious combinations first. Nothing. Then he shone the flashlight back into the empty cavity and inspected every surface. On the underside of the plate they had just removed, something was scratched into the metal. Small, precise numbers, etched with a sharp tool. 7 to 1, 4. He wanted someone to find it, Caleb said. Someone paying close enough attention. He dialed 714. The padlock clicked open. Inside the chest, everything was wrapped in plastic. 3 leather-bound journals, thick and worn at the covers. A manila envelope stuffed with papers. A smaller envelope of photographs. And on top of everything else, a single sealed letter. On the front of the envelope, in careful old-fashioned handwriting, were 4 words, "To whoever finds this." Caleb opened it. The letter was 2 pages long, written in neat print on lined notebook paper. It began simply. "If you are reading this, you found what I hid. Good. That means the Clara is still afloat. Which means she outlasted them. Which is exactly what I built her to do." The man's name was Gideon Hale. He had been a fisherman in Cedar Point since the age of 16. He wrote the letter on March 14, 8 years before Caleb and Nora ever set foot in town, because, he said, tomorrow he had to leave, and he did not think he would be coming back. He wrote that there were people in Cedar Point who wanted him gone. People with authority. He knew things they did not want known, and he had made the mistake of telling them that he knew. He called it foolish. He said he should have let the evidence speak for itself. But he was an old man, he wrote, and he had never been good at staying quiet when something was wrong. He told whoever was reading the letter that everything the town needed to know was in the journals. Every dollar, every name, every date. 3 decades of careful records, and the last 3 years were the ones that mattered most. The financial documents would confirm it. And then the letter ended with a line that stopped Caleb cold. Do with it what I could not. They took the chest up to the main cabin. Spread everything on the fold-down table. 3 journals, a manila envelope, a packet of photographs. Caleb opened the first journal. The earliest entries were from over 30 years ago. Gideon wrote in the same careful print as the letter, but looser, the handwriting of a man writing for himself, not for a stranger. Fishing logs. Household accounts. Observations about the harbor, the weather, the boats. Simple and direct, unadorned. The journal of a working man tracking his life. Then, about 60 pages in, the first entry that revealed what Gideon had really been doing. October 21st. He had heard from B at the diner that a fisherman named Tommy could not make his dock payment that month, medical bills from a back surgery. Gideon went to the harbor office after hours and paid it anonymously. He did not want Tommy to know. He just wanted Tommy to keep fishing. Caleb turned the page. November 8th. $200 in an envelope, slid under a neighbor's door after dark. Their youngest needed glasses and they could not afford the eye doctor. Gideon had written that she would probably think it came from the church fund. December 14th. He paid $412 in back taxes on a family's property. 3 years overdue. The county was going to seize it in January. That was most of what he had saved that season. But the family had 4 children, he wrote, and nowhere else to go. Page after page. Year after year. Caleb and Nora read through the first journal together and then went back and read sections again. Over 30 years, Gideon Hale had been quietly, invisibly holding this town together. Anonymous cashiers checks to the electric company when families fell behind. Cash under doors in the middle of the night. He paid the funeral costs for a deckhand who died without insurance. He funded 4 years of nursing school tuition for a local girl, mailing payments to the college bursar's office with no return address. He covered a widow's mortgage for 6 months after her husband drowned in a storm. He was not rich. The fishing logs made that plain. He caught what everyone else caught. Sold at the same prices. Paid the same fuel costs. But his own expenses were almost nothing. He lived on the boat. He ate simply. He wore the same clothes until they fell apart. The gap between what he earned and what he spent went entirely into other people's lives, year after year, without a single person knowing. Near the end of the first journal, Caleb stopped on a single line that Gideon had written as if it were just an observation about the weather. Being invisible does not make you useless. It makes you free to do what is right without anybody watching. The second journal was different in tone. Sharper. More careful. It covered a period starting about 10 years before Gideon disappeared, and it told an entirely different story. The entries began with Gideon noticing small discrepancies in the harbor's financial records. A maintenance fund balance that did not match the posted statement. A shortfall of a few $1,000s that grew week by week. He had asked the harbor master about it, a man named Frank, and Frank had called it a clerical error. But when Gideon checked again, the numbers had been changed. Not corrected. Changed. He kept looking. Over 2 years of careful, methodical entries, Gideon documented what he found. Frank, who had been harbor master of Cedar Point for over 2 decades, had been quietly draining the harbor maintenance fund for years. Not all at once, that would be noticed. But a few thousand here, a contract steered toward a cousin who wanted waterfront property, a repair budget allocated but never spent. The money that should have gone to fixing the piers and the seawall and the fuel docks had instead disappeared into Frank's personal accounts. Over 10 years, the total ran to over $80,000. The third journal was the most urgent. The entries were close together, sometimes daily. Gideon had confronted Frank at his office and told him he had the records. Frank had gone white, then angry. He said Gideon was an old man who did not understand how budgets worked. He told him to mind his own business. Then Frank came to the boat at night and told Gideon directly, if he went to the county with what he had, he would regret it. He could have his fishing slip revoked. His license pulled. Two men Gideon did not recognize showed up at the dock a week later and stood on the pier for an hour watching him work. Frank watched from the harbor office window the whole time. Frank offered money. Gideon refused. Frank leveraged an old debt, a loan he had made Gideon years ago after Gideon's wife died, when he could not cover the funeral costs. The loan had been repaid, but never formalized in writing. Frank said he would take it to court. And then the final entries came quickly. September 10th, Gideon writing that he had decided. He was sealing everything in the Clara. The journals, the financial records, the bank statements, all of it. If something happened to him, the boat would outlast them all. Steel does not forget. September 11th, finished the compartment. Welded the plate himself. Sealed it with marine epoxy. Scratched the combination into the back of the cover plate where only someone careful enough to look inside would find it. September 12th, called his sister Ruth. Told her he had to go. Told her not to worry. Told her everything was on the boat. She tried to argue. He hung up before she could change his mind. Then, tomorrow I leave. I do not know what happens next. I am 74 years old and I have spent my whole life on the water. If that is where I end, it is not the worst place. B came down to the boat the next morning with breakfast and took one look at the journals spread across the table. They told her. Not everything at first, just the first journal, the 30 years of anonymous giving. B listened in silence as they read her the entries. When they told her about Tommy Garland's dock payment, about the month her husband's slip fees had been covered by an anonymous donor, she put her hand over her mouth and then took it away again. She sat very still. Tommy always thought it was the church, she said quietly. Then she asked if there was more. Caleb told her the last two journals were different. That they were about money that had gone missing. About someone stealing from the town. He did not say who, not yet. He said they needed to understand what they were holding before they said anything more. B stood up and looked at them for a long moment. You two are 19 years old, she said. You bought a dead man's boat for $10. And now you are sitting on something that could shake this town apart. She paused at the door. Be careful who you trust with this. Then she walked back up the dock without looking back. They went to find Ruth Hale. She lived in a small gray house at the edge of town, past the post office, where the streets ended and the salt marsh began. She opened the door before Nora finished knocking, took one look at them, and then looked at the journal in Caleb's hands. You bought the boat, she said. Yes, ma'am. And you found what he left. She stepped back and let them in. Ruth had been waiting 8 years for this moment, though she had never been sure it would come. She listened to everything. She sat in her chair and listened to the first journal, the 30 years of invisible generosity, and she read passages herself, her lips moving with the words. When she reached the entries about a nursing student whose 4 years of tuition had been quietly funded by an anonymous source, she set the book down and said, that was Maria Reyes. She is a nurse at the county hospital now. She has a family. She told everyone she got a scholarship. She did, Nora said. From your brother? Ruth's eyes were bright, but she did not cry. She said that Gideon was not a soft man, not the kind of person you would look at and see a saint. He was hard and quiet and he did not suffer fools. But he saw people. He saw what they needed and he did something about it, every single time, without anyone knowing. When Caleb told her about the second and third journals, the embezzlement, the confrontation with Frank, the threats, the two men on the dock, Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I always knew Frank had something to do with Gideon leaving. I could never prove it. But the way Frank looked whenever anyone mentioned my brother. The way he avoided me in town. He has not made eye contact with me in 8 years. She also said something that stayed with them. She said, "You are 2 kids. Nobody in this town knows you. Frank has connections. He has the council's ear. He could say you planted the evidence. He could say you were trying to run some kind of scam. You walked in off the highway 2 days ago with nothing. Documents can be dismissed. People can be discredited. You need to understand what you are walking into before you do anything with this." She was not trying to stop them. She was trying to prepare them. The pressure arrived 2 days later. A notice from the harbor office appeared on the Clara's wheelhouse door, taped in a plastic sleeve, formal and official looking. It said the vessel had been inspected and found to be in violation of 3 harbor safety codes. Inadequate fire suppression. Missing life safety equipment. Non-functional bilge pump. They had 72 hours to comply or face condemnation and removal. Nobody had come onto that boat. Caleb knew it. Nora knew it. But they also knew that getting angry about it was not the same as dealing with it. So they walked to the harbor office, filled out the required requisition forms with absolutely level voices, collected 2 fire extinguishers and a set of life vests, and Caleb fixed the bilge pump that afternoon. It was a stuck float switch. 10 minutes. That evening, Caleb sat on the deck in the cold and said the thing Nora had been waiting for him to say. He said they could take the $5,000 Frank had offered. Buy a car. Drive south for the winter. Find work somewhere warm. They had survived this long by not making enemies. Every time they stayed too long somewhere, something went wrong. Nora did not answer right away. When she did, she said, "Do you remember what they told us the day we aged out of the system? They said good luck. That was it. 14 years. And the exit speech was 2 words. She said nobody had fought for them. Not the caseworkers, not the foster parents, not the state. They had been invisible their whole lives, and that was exactly how this town had treated Gideon. He spent 30 years saving people and they forgot him the moment he was gone. And now we are holding the truth in our hands," she said. "If we run, Frank gets away with it. The town never learns what Gideon did for them. His sister spends the rest of her life wondering. And we spend the rest of ours knowing we had the chance to do something right and walked away from it. Nobody ever fought for us," she said. "Maybe that is exactly why we have to fight for him." They verified everything first. They organized the financial documents by date. They compared the photographs Gideon had taken, piers and seawalls that were supposed to have been repaired, captured in images that showed clearly the work had never been done, against the budget documents claiming the repairs had been completed and paid for. They cross-referenced Gideon's journal entries against the town's own public records. The numbers matched. Every single one. Before they went anywhere, they took the bus to a bank in a nearby city, Beaumont, about 40 miles down the coast. Gideon's third journal had contained one final detail they had not fully processed at first. A brief entry near the end, referencing a trust account he had established at a bank in Beaumont. He had written, "The Clara is the key. Whoever holds her holds everything. I have named no person, only the vessel. The rightful registered owner of the Clara has access to the trust." They brought the boat's registration and deed to the bank branch manager and explained how they had come to own the Clara. The manager verified the vessel identification number. He checked the ownership chain. He asked for their identification. Then he looked at his screen for a long moment and leaned back in his chair. Gideon Hale, he said, had been contributing to this trust account for over 25 years. He had also directed his investments through the bank's managed portfolio the entire time. The balance, as of that month, was $412,000. Caleb did not move. Nora did not move. The manager explained that the trust had specific distribution guidelines. The funds were designated for the benefit of the Cedar Point Harbor community, infrastructure repair, emergency assistance to fishing families, and educational support. The registered owner of the Clara served as trustee. The man who had lived on canned goods and 3 shirts and slid envelopes under doors in the middle of the night had been quietly building a safety net for his town for a quarter of a century. He had saved and invested the same way he had given, consistently, invisibly, without ever drawing attention to what he was doing. And now 2 teenagers who had never owned anything more valuable than a dead sedan were the trustees of the largest gift Cedar Point had ever received. They took the financial evidence to the county clerk's office in Beaumont. The clerk listened, asked questions, made copies, and told them she would forward everything to the county inspector's office. On the way back, Nora stopped at a pay phone outside the bus station and called the regional newspaper. She asked for the news desk and gave a reporter the outline of the story, just the shape of it, and told him where to find the records. The story ran 3 days later. Front page of the Beaumont Register. The headline was direct: Harbor Master accused of decade-long embezzlement. Cedar Point fishermen's hidden journals detail secret generosity and financial fraud. The article told 3 stories at once. Frank's embezzlement, confirmed by county investigators who found discrepancies matching Gideon's documentation exactly. Gideon's 30 years of anonymous giving, verified by the reporter who tracked down 4 of the families Gideon had helped. And Caleb and Nora, 2 teenagers out of foster care who had bought a cursed boat for $10 and found the truth that everyone else had missed. The town's reaction was not anger directed at them. It was silence, and then the silence broke open. People started coming forward. A man named Pete Alvarez walked into the Compass Rose and told B that someone had paid for his daughter's eyeglasses when she was 8 years old. He had always assumed it was the church. Clara Henderson, whose family had nearly lost their home to back taxes 20 years earlier, sat in BEA's booth and cried. Her parents had told her it was a government program. There was no government program. There was Gideon Hale and a cashier's check. Maria Reyes, now a nurse at the county hospital, called the newspaper. She had received 4 years of tuition from a source she could never identify. She had told everyone it was a national scholarship fund. Story after story. Family after family. Moments of grace spread across decades, paid bills, anonymous envelopes, debts that had simply vanished, all of them traced back to the same quiet man who sat at the corner diner every morning for 30 years, ordered black coffee, and never said more than 10 words. B put a photograph of Gideon behind the counter, next to the register. Nobody asked her to. Nobody asked her to take it down. Frank was suspended from his position 4 days after the article ran. The county inspector arrived with a team and spent 2 days at the harbor office confirming what Gideon had documented. The numbers matched. The missing funds were real. The contracts steered to Frank's cousin were confirmed in town records. Frank did not deny it. He cooperated fully with the investigation, provided his personal records and bank statements, and confirmed everything in Gideon's journals. He pleaded guilty at the county courthouse in December. He read a statement acknowledging what he had done, not abstractly, but specifically. The amounts. The methods. The moment he had crossed the line the first time and every decision that followed. He said that threatening Gideon Hale was the worst thing he had ever done. He said he would carry it for the rest of his life. The judge sentenced him to 18 months in a minimum security facility and 5 years of probation. His harbor master certification was permanently revoked. Cedar Point did not forgive Frank quickly. The town was not built for quick forgiveness. But they heard him say what he had done without hiding behind lawyers or technicalities, and some people thought that mattered, even if they could not fully say why. That evening, B made a plate of food and left it on his doorstep. No note. Just a plate covered in foil on a cold December night, the same kind of anonymous gesture that someone had made for her family years ago when an envelope appeared and saved them from losing everything. She had not known it was Gideon then. She knew now. And she understood that the chain of grace did not stop just because the person who started it was gone. 3 months later, the Clara May had a new coat of paint. Dark blue, the same color Gideon had kept her in. Caleb had done the work himself, sanding the rust, priming the bare steel, 3 coats with a roller and a brush. The deck was scrubbed white. The wheelhouse windows were clear. The engine ran, rebuilt piece by piece, fuel lines replaced, injectors cleaned, new water pump and starter motor sourced from a marine salvage yard 30 miles down the coast. The first time the diesel turned over and caught, the sound echoed across the harbor. Bea came out of the diner and stood on the porch to listen. The Clara had been silent for 8 years. Now she had a heartbeat. The Hale Harbor Trust had been formally established 6 weeks after the bank visit in Beaumont. A county lawyer helped set up the foundation. Ruth was on the board. Bea was on the board. Nora managed the books. The trust's first act was funding emergency repairs to the main pier, where pilings had been rotting for years because the maintenance budget that Frank had stolen never existed. 3 fishing boats that had been dry-docked returned to the water. The seawall on the north side of the harbor, crumbling into the channel, was reinforced. The fuel dock was repaired. Caleb had a job with a marine mechanic named Dale Perkins, who had pointed at a seized outboard on a workbench and said, "Show me." Caleb had the engine running in 2 hours. Dale hired him that afternoon. Nora was studying for her GED at the county library in Beaumont, 3 days a week, on the same bus that had taken them to the bank the day they found out about the trust. She was also managing the trust's bookkeeping with the same precision she had always brought to survival, tracking every dollar, filing every report, making the numbers accountable. Ruth visited the trawler almost every day. She sat in a folding chair Caleb had placed in the wheelhouse, sometimes reading from her brother's journals, sometimes just watching the water. She said once that Gideon would have hated the attention. He would have hated the newspaper stories and the photograph behind the counter at the diner and the town finally saying his name out loud. But he would have liked seeing the harbor work again. He would have liked seeing the boats go out. On a cold Saturday afternoon in late January, they took the Clara out of the harbor for the first time. Caleb at the wheel, Nora at the bow, Ruth in her chair in the wheelhouse. The engine ran smooth and strong. The hull cut the water cleanly. The boat that had not moved in 8 years moved now, steady and sure, carrying 3 people into the open ocean on a gray winter afternoon. They did not go far. A mile offshore, maybe 2. Just enough to feel the water under them. Just enough to see the town from the sea, the docks and the pier and the rooftops and the small lit window of the Compass Rose, small from this distance, the gray house at the edge of town where Ruth had waited 8 years for the truth to come back. The town looked fragile from the water. Small. The kind of place that could disappear if nobody took care of it. Gideon had taken care of it quietly and invisibly for 30 years, and when he was gone, it had started to fall apart. Now the people who understood what invisibility felt like were carrying that work forward. They turned the boat back toward the harbor. The sun was low, turning the water golden silver and flat. Caleb eased the Clara through the channel and brought her alongside Slip 14. He cut the engine and the boat settled into its mooring with the slow, familiar creak of a vessel that had come home. Ruth climbed off and stood on the dock. She looked at the Clara for a long moment, freshly painted, engine running, alive again. Then she said thank you. She was not talking to Caleb and Nora, not exactly. She was talking to the boat, or to the man who had built his life on it, or to both. Then she walked back toward her house at the edge of town. Caleb leaned against the wheelhouse door. Nora was beside him with her journal open in her lap. She had a new list going. Longer than any she had ever made before. Not a survival list, not things to watch for, exits to keep clear, worst-case scenarios to plan around. This was a list of things to build. Certifications to pursue. Programs to fund. A community that had been forgetting itself, slowly remembering what it was. A $10 boat, Caleb said. A dead man's journals. That is what it took. Nora closed the journal. No, she said. That is not what it took. It took 2 people who knew what it felt like to be invisible. Who had spent their whole lives watching the world ignore them. That is what it took. That is why we were the ones who looked. They had arrived in Cedar Point with $43 and everything they owned in their arms. The system that raised them had given them exactly 2 words of farewell and then closed the door. For a year and a half, they had survived by being resourceful and careful and deeply, quietly good at taking care of each other. And then a car died on a highway. And a woman at a diner said that a boat has a roof. And 2 teenagers who had nothing bought the one thing the entire town had given up on. And in the dark of a steel hull, in a sealed compartment that nobody had opened in 8 years, they found the life's work of a man who had spent 30 years refusing to look away from the people nobody else could see. Gideon Hale had been invisible his whole life. So had they. That was exactly why they were the ones who found him. The harbor was dark now. The water was still. A buoy bell rang somewhere far out across the channel, the same bell that had sounded on their very first night aboard, low and distant and steady. The Clara May rocked gently at slip 14, the same slow rhythm she had kept for 8 years while the secret in her hull waited for the right person to come along. She was not waiting anymore. None of them were. The people nobody sees are usually the ones holding everything together. Gideon knew that. Now so did they. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.